Board members, if we can get you to take your seats, good recess. We are a little bit behind schedule, but we know how to catch up at times, so I have full faith. We've had good discussion so far. Next on our agenda is, it's on number 6. This is information and then action. This is our 2018-2019 RISE data review and accountability use. And we have Darren Nielsen, and we've invited Scott up to table. And so, Darren, I'm going to turn the time over to you, and if you'll introduce Scott, and then a little bit before we get into this, there's an expectation there you're going to share some information and how you want that done. You want to get through all your information, and then as people have questions, you want them to save at the end, or what? What do you prefer? And I'm using the wrong mouse to recognize you. Here we go.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Darren Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning. And I would like to introduce Dr. Scott Marion, who's the Executive Director for the Center for Assessment based out of Dover, New Hampshire. It's also their company, the Center for Assessment, is under contract to provide consulting services to the State Board of Education and has had a relationship with our state since 2002 or 2003. They've been a vital partner for us in making sure that we're able to deliver valid and reliable state assessments, and also advising us on accountability. I'd also like to recognize, we're going to talk about, I'm going to go over a summary of some analysis that's been conducted over this past summer, spring, summer, and fall. And I want to recognize some people who were involved in that. In the room today, we have Ben Jamison and Brooke Anderson, representatives from Jordan School District. Brooke was a contributor to the state analysis team that we're going to talk about their results. And we also have Michelle Amioy and Jeffrey Lutz from Salt Lake City School District, who contributed their time, in addition to our staff with data and statistics and members of the assessment accountability team who presented and created some of the work that we're going to talk about today. And then also, you have a policy advisory group, which is referenced in the civic clerk, the Assessment Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. I believe we have some members from that committee who are here with us today, and I would ask that they would just stand so you could see who those members are. We also have 2 board members that serve on that, but thank you. One more coming in, and then, okay, thank you.
There's quite a contingency back there in the soft seats.
So there's, I guess the point here is that there's been an extensive amount of work that's been conducted as a result of the disruptions that we experienced with our state standards assessment last year with our vendor Questar. In addressing, Chair, how we'd like this to go, obviously the board can ask questions. We have about 30 slides. We're trying to condense the summary report down. We presented this with APAC, which was a 3-hour meeting, and then with the TAC, which followed a day and a half of meetings. And then internally, we've spent many hours going over this. So we're trying to provide you the information you need to make decisions or to understand the complexities of this issue in a timely manner. So with 30 slides, if we give that about a minute a slide, that's 30 minutes of the hour, and then questions could be after. And we can go back through the slides. So if you'll just make a note, that might be the most efficient way to do it. But obviously, if there are questions that can't wait, I'll respond to those.
Well, let's just have them refer to the slide and have them take their personal notes, board members, of what slide you have a question on, and make a little note, and then we can get through this presentation, because you're in the effort to be efficient and the answers might be in a later slide, and so let's get through the 30 slides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to introduce this, I've put up here on this slide, it's just information that came out of, you know that there was an audit. If you don't, many of you know that there was an audit by the Office of the Legislative Auditor General. They released the first of 4 chapters of that audit results, and I do want to publicly acknowledge there were no findings in that audit. I was very proud to be part of an assessment accountability section that has practices in place. That these auditors have spent nearly a year with us, and there were no findings in that chapter that was released. So I think it's important to note, I say that publicly everywhere that I go, and this was specifically related to the implementation of the RISE assessment. But these bullet items come directly from a survey the auditors did with our staff, and they articulate what we felt here at the state board as your staff and what you might have felt and heard throughout the testing experience. These are some of the challenges that administrators who responded to their survey, they had 90 people from the state respond to this. These are some of the impacts that they declared that they felt in their school. The most significant of those, while I don't want to minimize any of them, is the very last bullet, the lack of confidence in the data. So right from the very beginning, from a public side, there's been concerns about the data because of the challenges with the delivery system. So the question and why it is very unusual that we would be talking about this with the board in a traditional year, every other year, is unprecedented. We would implement the data, we'd take the data and implement it as policies and rules tell us to, and there wouldn't be a discussion with the board. But because of the public nature of this and the concern across the public, I thought it would be wise to bring this issue before the board. So we have conducted 3 fairly what I would call extensive studies. The first one there, the Utah Test Interruption Study, was conducted. It was required that Questar conduct that and look specifically at the impact of the 5 interruption, the days of interruption during the tests. And that had to be reviewed by a third party, and the Center for Assessment did that, so he'll speak to that today. We also had in place a student growth percentile across transition study that was done. That's looking at the Sage to Rise and Sage to Utah Aspire Plus. We're still in the final stages of the Sage to Utah Aspire Plus, but we'll talk about the Sage to Rise and how that impacts student growth percentiles. That also would pick up evidence if we had issues with the integrity of our data, because it pulls out our achievement data and puts it in the growth form. And then we have this team that I referenced earlier, staff here. Your staff partnered with representatives from Jordan and Salt Lake City School District who looked at our achievement data pretty broadly and extensively. And I'll ask Dr. Marion to talk about some of the slides from that study. So again, I just want you to see there's been extensive work that's been done to try to determine the impacts on student learning. The last thing I'll say is, the data that we are going to talk about today starts a long time ago. It starts out with instruction from a teacher to a student or a class of students. And I want to acknowledge that and honor that. And then a test is given, in this case the RISE test. And that's a very personal experience for the student. For those of us, all of us have tested, and when we're sitting down taking a test, there's emotion tied to that. There's all kinds of things. It's very personal. What we're going to talk about today, though, and Heidi mentioned this earlier in public comments, we're looking at the macro level. So while we're going to be talking about large numbers and percentages and measuring impact, that in no way takes away from individual students' experiences that they may or may not have had during the testing experience. So I want to acknowledge that. And then, Chair, if I could turn the time over to Dr. Marion.
Okay, it's good to go.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as Darren said, we've looked at this quite carefully. And whenever I get in front of a policy body, we work in about 35 states doing similar types of work. Utah's my favorite state to work in by far. I always try to sort of hit this mantra of when measuring change, do not change the measure. So everybody always wants to tweak things, but every time we do, we have to figure out how we could bridge that gap from one system to another. Sometimes it's a very easy thing to do because it's a very small change. Sometimes it's a bigger change. And we've developed sets of procedures and practices over the years to help us analyze whether or not the change is having an adverse impact on the ability to measure trends in educational performance. What we've done here and what we're going to present are 3 sets of analyses to help us answer this question. Did the changes that we saw have an effect on student and school performance? I want to remind folks that we had planned changes in the assessment system. And that actually, if you would have asked me to put money down ahead of the testing year, I would have said that these plan changes were well, I didn't know about the interruptions before the testing year. We try to avoid those. But these would have had a bigger effect. And these are the things that we, as the technical advisors, were more concerned about. When you remove writing prompts from an English language arts assessment, it becomes a reading assessment, and it sort of changes the thing we're measuring. Moving the administration from what we call an item level adaptive to a multi-stage adaptive, things like that. The high school, we were actually had more concerns about moving from an end of course test, Algebra 1, geometry, things like that, or Math 1, Math 2, to these tests that are given at grade levels for all kids in that grade level. So we actually were concerned about this, and that's why we're going to talk about 3 sets of analyses. The student growth analyses are really like the canary in the coal mine kind of analyses. If we're going to see an effect, we're going to see it in student growth, and I'll explain a little bit more about that first. Before I do that, though, we had some unplanned changes, and this is the test interruption study. We're going to talk about this first. So the primary focus was asking the question, was the performance of students who were unable to advance immediately to session 2 due to disruption negatively affected by the disruption? And for those of you who don't live in this world of multi-stage testing, let me just brief explanation. The way that the test is designed is students all sit for session 1. And based on their performance on session 1, which is sort of a middle-of-the-road test, right? Based on their performance there, students get routed to a more challenging set of questions or a less challenging set of questions or more middle-of-the-road questions. And why do you do that? You do that so you can hone in on the student's achievement much quicker than you could if you gave everybody the exact same set of test items. This follows what you had been doing under SAGE for many years. It's just a different version of adaptive testing. But the important thing here is after the student finishes stage 1, the computer has to do some thinking. And that's where the interruptions happen. So we had kids finishing stage 1, so we have those records. And then there's kids at 4 or 5 different times where they were not able to advance immediately to stage 2. Usually it was an overnight resetting required. So I just want to preface that. In addition to the Center for Assessment reviewing the results of the study, because to raise any potential conflicts of interest that you don't already know about, the study was done by a researcher at Educational Testing Service. Educational Testing Service is the parent company of Questar. We had some questions about that. That's why we offered to review the study. But we also brought it to the National Technical Advisory Committee here, in the Technical Advisory Committee in Utah that has been meeting. The membership has changed over the years. But these are top educational measurement and evaluation specialists around the country. We have members from the University of Oregon, University of Colorado, University of Georgia, BYU, and an independent consultant who's an English language learning specialist from California, worked at WestEd for many years. So it's a top-notch committee. They also reviewed this report. Basically, you have kids who had this interruption. They completed session 1, and they had an interruption. They couldn't proceed to session 2. They eventually proceeded to session 2 a day or 2 later, and those students were labeling the quote-unquote special review students. The non-special review students are all students who completed both sessions of the test. Those of you who think about evaluation would say, well, those aren't equivalent groups. We have this technique called propensity score matching. It's basically trying to make groups equivalent by matching them on a whole variety of background factors. What score did they get on the test last year? What kind of demographic makeup is their school? What kind of school are they in? Large, small, things like that. So you do the best job you can. It's not the same as a true experiment where you randomly assign kids. That would be cruel to randomly assign kids to have an interrupted session and a non-interrupted session. So you do it post hoc the best way that you can. And it's pretty well documented and proven method in the research literature. What they found, and we dug through this very carefully is that after doing a variety of sets of analyses, that when you compare the performance of the students who were disrupted with the non-disrupted students, after all this adjustment is the propensity score matching, there was no evidence of any kind of impact, negative or positive. The ETS researcher, we actually told them they had to take this out of the report, made the mistake of saying, we actually even saw some positive impact. I said, well, nobody's going to believe that that was possible. And so let's just take that out of the report. But there was clearly no evidence of a negative impact. And the Technical Advisory Committee and the Center for Assessment and the your assessment and Accountability Advisory Committee agreed with the study's analyses, their methods, their analyses, and their conclusions. I think, how could that happen? Right? How could they go through this interruption and you not see an effect? Rich Hill, who founded the Center for Assessment, has been retired about 10 years, actually started with me here in Utah in 2002, really led the field on doing these interruption studies. And we started them when people started moving to computer. As soon as people started moving to computer, we had a new line of work because there was a lot of interruptions when they first started. And every time we did it in like 4 or 5 states. We couldn't see an effect. And the Rich figured, and this is what I figure, is that teachers, principals, IT folks in the schools run around like crazy to try to keep the kids calm and tell them, don't worry about it, we'll get it fixed, you're fine. The kids are probably thinking, I'll do something else today. I'm not going to take a test today. I'll take a test tomorrow. When they come back tomorrow and they take a test, kids are pretty resilient. And this is what we've seen in state after state. So it's not good to have this, and it's a headache for schools, as Darren started this. But the reality is we didn't see an effect. Next study that we're more interested in, we could see. I told you we were more worried about the planned transitions, the growth, the transition from SAGE to Aspire Plus and SAGE to RISE in terms of the differences in test. Now, the growth transition study also enables us to evaluate if we see any effects of test interruption as well. I offered to give a long explanation about student growth percentiles. Darren assured me that that was best use of time. But student growth percentiles of how we calculate student growth in Utah and about 30 other states. The beauty of student growth percentiles is they're generally what we call scale agnostic. We could switch test scales from year to year because it really is based on where students fall in a distribution. And it's a distribution based on what we call academic peers. So you're only compared to kids who have the same score history as you, or in mathematical terms, the best line of best fit through that. But it's really, high kids are not being compared to low kids are not being compared to high kids. You're being compared to kids like you. Now, so even though it's scale agnostic, so I said we switch some of these things, it should be okay. It's not enough when you change the test, and like I said, moving from a English language arts test to a reading test many people would say that's a big change. So therefore, we should not assume that these growth estimates are interchangeable. So if a school typically had growth estimates of slightly above average under SAGE, could we assume that they would have growth estimates slightly above average under RISE? That's really the kind of question we're asking, or vice versa. And so you see the 2 research questions there, and we're really interested in that green one, right? Do the comparisons hold across various types of schools? So it's one thing to be okay on average, but being okay on average could sometimes hide important things, right? We say, I'm from the Northeast. People in the mountains here know this, right? You could have 1 foot on a block of ice and 1 foot on a wood stove, and on average, you're pretty comfortable. But the average is not, it hides a lot of things as well. So what we look at is these mean. So every student has a growth percentile. Basically, how did they perform this year based on their prior score history? And then we average those at the school or subgroup level. And so that's what you'll see in these analyses. And then we summarize them by school and by school types that we define by size, locale, demographic composition, et cetera. We have a very extensive report. Mr. Chair, you'll be pleased to know we did condense this down to 30 slides, like Darren said. So what we saw is that the growth percentiles were quite stable. And like I said, more than I would have predicted from 2018 to 2019 when you compared it to prior years. So if you look at what was the change from 2015 to 2016, 2016 to 2017, and so on, how did the 2018 to 2019 student growth percentiles compare? And what we did see, and this was not surprising because we saw something like this in Colorado last year. Colorado was much more of a dramatic effect. We saw a little bit of a differential impact on English language arts. And what I mean by that is when you take writing out, you tend to actually favor boys over girls. In other words, girls are better writers, and typically. So if you have writing on the test, they're going to do a little bit better. And so it doesn't mean that boys outscored girls. It's a relative game, right? They just might have done a little better relative to girls, and that would improve their student growth percentile. And we saw slight impact on Hispanic versus white students. Again, fairly slight. And so one of the things we look at is, well, how big were these differences? And I'm going to show you a graph just of the male-female one on the next page. But we're talking about growth percentiles that vary by just plus or minus 5 student growth percentiles, which are quite small. And as you'll see from this picture, what that shows is the middle bars are 0 to -1 and 0 to +1. That's like a flip of a coin. And even plus or minus 2 is like a flip of a coin. And so what you see is the blue bars represent males, and the orange reddish bars represent females. And so where you see the blue bars higher on the right-hand side, you could see that boys were outperforming girls in student growth percentiles. Again, I want to keep in mind that the whole scale here only goes from negative to +5. It's a small scale. Student growth percentiles range from 1 to 99. And so most of them are clustered in the middle. The other important thing to keep in mind is that you do not have any accountability systems that hold individual kids accountable for their student growth. These are all rolled up at the school level. And so, for instance, most schools hover around 50-50. And I'm not saying that this is, a way to just brush it under the rug, but as long as most schools are 50-50, the advantages and disadvantages that we see here will wash out. And again, I want to emphasize one more time, we're dealing with small differences, but they're there. High school, what we saw, again, we expected to see bigger changes in high school. And what we saw is some trends. We saw slight decreases in math for females because the end of course tests had a little more open-ended questions on them, but the Aspire Plus doesn't. But for females, there was actually no trend in ELA. We're surprised by that, but we're empiricists. We go where the data will take us. And the changes in science were slight there as well. Again, you could read that. All these things that we saw, even if we saw what looked like a finding in one grade, we didn't see it in the other grade. So, like for instance, in science, if you see it in grade 9, if you think you have a pattern, you should see it in grade 10, vice versa. Again, so what's the impact on accountability? Stuff that you folks have to care about. And so the way that we judged impact is that we only focused on the growth indicator. Again, so we didn't focus on the whole accountability system for right now because growth is the place where we're going to see these changes. And so we're basically evaluating how growth works in the accountability system across years. And so what we see here, this is RISE. This is this movement from SAGE to RISE. And so if you see on the bottom axis, or those of you who remember your data and statistics, your x-axis, we go from 2015 through 2019. And this is what we call a stacked bar chart. So what we have here is the blue component of the bar represents what we could call exemplary performance. You don't set, you guys know this, right? You don't set cut scores on the individual indicators, but if we applied the overall grades to just growth, this is what it would look like. And so you see there, you have the blue is the most exemplary category. That I think it's yellow is like proficient or pretty good, or in your language like a B. And then C is the gray, and I think that's reddish orange is a D, and then the other blue, the darker blue, is an F. And what you see there is that change of 32 to 34 in the yellow, and 6 to 5 in the blue is kind of change. If you look back in previous years, you saw bigger changes from 2017 to 2018. And we had none of this stuff going on. And so you had the bigger change in the test of removing one writing prompt from 17 to 18. That might have had the effect there for all we know. But the point is as far as we could see, these are indistinguishable across years. This is looking just if we did this only on female students. So you could see that there's a slight decline in school level performance. If you had a school of an all-girls school, it would have an effect in that sense. And obviously, since it's a zero-sum game, the boys, this is boys, you see the reverse pattern. And again, we see this is for, we looked at this, as I mentioned, we looked at this for all sorts of demographic groups. Again, I'm not going to go through a million of them, but this is for students who were on free and reduced lunch. So again, if we had a school that was just made up of kids on free and reduced lunch, what would be the impact? And again, you see that the 2018 to 2019 are virtually indistinguishable in terms of the impact. So what's our summary? For the growth stuff, we're going to talk a little bit, one more set of analyses. So even with some of the changes, and when we did a whole set of analyses on just how do the scale scores, right, the scores that the kids get in a given year, how do they correlate across years? I saved you from that. That's in the report because it tells the same story. The impact data does not reveal any noticeable trends in how the growth indicator scores or performance levels are projected to change in 2019 because of the transition to RISE or Aspire Plus. One more set of analyses. You doing this? Okay.
You're doing a great job.
And so then we had, so you should know that your staff here at the state office been working quite tirelessly to do parallel analyses, different analyses than we were doing. And I have to give a lot of credit to my staff, Leslie King, who helps run our technical advisory committee here, as well as Damian Biederbenner and Adam Van Iwarden, who run the student growth percentiles. People have been working around the clock. We've had delays in getting the data out of the testing companies, but we didn't have any delays in when this meeting was going to happen, so we had to get this produced. And so we looked at these questions here, and it's basically do this patterns of means and distributions, because means are, like I just told you about the block of ice and a wood stove, right? Means are not enough. So standard deviations are a measure of variability. So if the variability changed, that would be a concern for us as well. And similarly, standard error tells us, this is one of those dirty little secrets in measurement, right? Every measurement has error. It's just a fact of life. You stand on your bathroom scale in the morning, it's got error. Did you have salt last night for dinner? Too much, right? You see, there's error. That's error in measurement. And so every test has measured. A way we characterize that is this thing called standard error. Does the standard error change from one year to the other? Because that would be a concern for us. And again, we talk about that. So again, maybe one picture, not going to be 1,000 words, but so what we have here is 5 years of state test data. And each graph is, you go from I think of what you're looking at, top left is grade 3, then across the top it's grade 3, grade 4, grade 5, and then the bottom is grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. What you see there, you have to look carefully because there's not much to see. The different curves indicate different years. We have 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, superimposed on one another. And what you see there, or don't see really, is you don't see any perceptible change in the means. And very importantly, so just to hint, 2019 is the pink one. You don't see any perceptible changes in the variation, in the variability. Now, what the important thing is, you will notice some minor year-to-year changes where the curves don't exactly overlap, and that's for any particular year. It's not necessarily 2019. And that's what we get all the time. And so the key take-home message here is, again, it's like we're buying a used car. We kicked the tires, we looked under the hood, we took it for a test drive on bumpy roads, on smooth roads. We just kept looking and couldn't find anything. This, I'm glad Brooke's here. This was genius, that what Darren and his team did is, I don't see this in many states like this. They brought folks who work with these data at the district level into this process. They know their schools, they know their kids, and they actually did. So this is an analysis that Brooke did in Jordan, and this is what we call a box and whiskers plot, right? Let's see why we call it that, right? And what that signifies is that the middle bar there that has the darker label, so if you look over on the right, it says 423.0. That's the mean or the average score for the year. And what the box signifies is the 25th to the 75th percentile of distribution. So that's where most of the kids, the middle 50% of the kids, are located. And then the whiskers are the 5th and 95th percentiles. Tells you how far it's distributed. The important thing there is, first of all, you look at the means, they're virtually identical. And Jordan's a big school district, so we get a good sense of that. And you look at the box, the 25th to the 75th percentile, you could just put them together. They would almost overlay with one another. Thank you, Brooke. And then the last thing that's very important is, you guys should be commended, the participation is moving in the right way. And Darren's going to finish up with that.
Yeah, so we've been talking about our data in the macro level, and we get questions, and I'm sure you do too. What about the individual students? What about the student who couldn't complete their test because of some kind of a variable? Or what about the student who had their test inadvertently reset? What I've put up here are some samples. We have a number of participation codes, and with the state standards test, we're required to put an explanation. Either a student has a score for a test they're required to take, or we put an explanation of why they didn't take the test, and there's business rules around how that then has impacted the accountability. So I'm going to pull out a few highlights. So we go back to 2016. We could have gone back farther. Out of respect for some of my staff, I just set that as the threshold. The 2019 year, though, there's an asterisk on that, and it's important because my data staff were uncomfortable with me using this data in this setting because it's still in raw format. What that means is we haven't gone through and applied all of the filter rules. So, for instance, if a student wasn't enrolled in a school for 160 days, there's a rule that tells what to do with that. This is very much day-to-day work that's still ongoing. So I'm using percentages because we don't expect those will change very much at all. But just a caveat, because they didn't want me to put in, I told them I need to see what this is, though. So did not test. You'll see that each year whether it's in 2019 or in any other year, there are a number of students, and if you figure we're around 100,000 around 1 million test events statewide last year, just under that number, I can give you an idea of what number of students we're talking about. Those students that just don't test and the LEA at the end doesn't have any other explanation, they just apply that code. Refuse to test, that category stayed pretty similar across all the years that we've looked at. USB excused, this one I want to talk about. There is a participation code, we know it as number 111, and it essentially is one that in order for an LEA to apply that code, they have to get permission from staff at the State Board of Education because it makes that student invisible to accountability. It pulls them out of the denominator and the numerator. And so you'll see that it's almost never used. This year there were some students, less than 0.04% of them, so it's a small number, but there were some students who, because of problems with the assessment delivery system, were not able to test, and the LEAs were given permission for those individual cases to apply the 111 code. So you'll see that's the explanation for that row. Invalidated is also a code that the LEA applies, so it's in a case where a student completes the test and there's something about it that the LEA believes it should be invalidated. An example of that is we had a classroom of students a year ago that the LEA determined there was some violations in the testing ethics and the proctoring of the test, and so at the end of the cycle, which is when they discovered it, they said we should just invalidate that whole class. That'd be an example of that. Parental exclusion, this is the opt-out percentage, and you'll see that this last year, surprisingly, despite all the publicity around this, that number dropped significantly. And this is important to note when we get to the very last column. USB assigned did not test. You'll see that every year there are a number of students across the state, because we're talking about big macro level numbers here again, that for whatever reason don't test, and we drill all the way down to the student level, and there has to be a participation code to identify the student's test event and explain it. The very last row, standard participation, this is the row we would like to see at 100%. This means that as a student, I was supposed to take a particular test, I took the test, and I have a scale score associated with that test. You'll see that 16, 17, and 18, those numbers are all almost the same. In 2019, we're looking at nearly 95% of the student population and eligible test events are into the system. That's important to note because the more data that we have into the system, the more opportunity for validity to the data. I think it's one of the flip side of that concern that we've heard schools say is parental opt-out pulls kids out, and it undermines the validity of our data because some of our top kids are pulled out of the system. But it's interesting to note the overall percent of test events, required test events that are into the data set this year. So in addition to this, these other elements we've looked at and provided to our LEAs. The challenge with this, unlike what Dr. Marion was talking about, we don't have comparative data to this because we don't typically require this level of detail from our vendor. But we required them to provide us by student SSID number, all test sessions that were reset, and the outcome of the reset. So you might have heard, and we saw through customer service tickets last year that when a student's test needed to be, we have Quest stars involved in the student test reset, so there were delays in that when it was necessary. And then we also had, towards the end of the testing window, just over 1,000 tests that were inadvertently reset by Quest star staff. Most of those were in one school. So you can imagine, and some of you might have heard about this from, if this school was in your area, you think your school's all done testing, you show up the next day, you log in the system, and it looks like nobody's begun their test. So we work with the vendor. It took more than a month to locate, restore those scores. So the good news is all those test scores that were submitted by the students were restored, and we have no evidence that they were invalid. The bad news, if we go back to the very first slide, questions about the integrity of the data. Remember one of the concerns? Those kind of things really undermine the field's confidence in the data itself. So we provided all of our LEAs that. Test transfers. So another concern that you might have heard and that we heard and we saw through the customer service tickets is Questar was required to be involved in the transfer process. So if I'm a student in Scott's school and I start a test, it's paused, and then I transfer during the testing window when I've got an active test session, because remember, they're not required to be finished in one setting, and I transfer. Questar had to do a process that would allow that data to transfer so that I could finish my test in my new school. We know there were concerns with their timeliness of those activities. So we've looked at all of that data and provided that to each LEA by LEA. Another issue that, again, brings to question publicly issues with confidence in the data was above grade level testing. We have around 3,000 students in our state, grades 3 through 8, who during this cycle of testing, they are enrolled in a course that is above their grade level. And this is most common found in math. A seventh grader taking eighth grade math, or an eighth grader taking secondary math 1. There were some challenges with their delivery system being able to provide access to the appropriate test for the students. So we requested, and they provided us a list by student, every student who was eligible for above grade level test, and what the conclusion of that was. What did they complete the test? Were they unable to complete it? And so forth. The last data set that we requested for them, and this goes to the field's concerns about start, stop, try to log in, can't log in, is this file about test attempts and system logins. And we've provided to every LEA a file that shows every test attempt, system login for their LEA specifically. I'm not going to say to you that we've gone over these data sets with a fine-tooth comb because we haven't had time to do that, but we have looked at it in a comparative nature of looking at test session resets. Does every LEA look like it's about the same? Are the numbers what we would think they would be? Again, we lack the ability to look at the previous 3, 4, 5 years on how many test resets is in a normal year or how many transfers is in a normal year. But we've tried to provide those descriptive statistics to all the LEAs and also to look at those internally, again, to look at our circumstances as closely as possible related to the test environment that our students experienced last year. So I guess in a summary, what we've tried to do on behalf of the board this year is look at our data as closely as we can from as many different angles as we can to give an understanding to not only the board but to the public at what level of confidence we should have in our data. I can tell you that some LEAs have taken what they do with their data and gone forward and met with teachers. One of the neighborhood districts in my area, last Friday, half-day teacher day, and they went through their data and followed through with the activities they typically do with the end-of-year state data, later than they typically would, which is a result of some of the problems we had with our prior vendor. But nonetheless, that work goes forward, and teachers continue to try to improve the performance of their students across the state. So that's the last of our slides.
I appreciate your patience, board members, on this presentation. I'm sure there's a few questions and comments, but so let's get through the questions before I will accept any motions. Board member Davis, did you have a question? Hang on one sec.
I have a motion, so I'll wait till the
Okay.
questions are done.
Will you turn your mic back on so I'll just say it? Board member Bolter, I know you had a question earlier.
Yes, I had just a quick question, and maybe you covered, I just wasn't sure. So you said that, did the glitches only occur in between stages, or was there any glitches within the stages?
Okay, so that's a great question. The ones that were publicized in the media, those interruption of service days, those were caused, all except the last one. The last one was unique. It was a third-party vendor's cloud server failing for the day. But the first four were very similar in nature, and it had to do with what Dr. Marion talked about. Students would go to submit their stage one, panel one of their test. We get caught into a circle, a pending.
Yeah.
It caused the anxiety from that would be, oh my gosh, did it save my answers? I've spent a lot of time on this. Did it save these? And then the second part is, what do we do to make sure we don't aggravate any problem that might be here? And then the next part is, as a school administrator or teacher, is this really disrupts what I'd planned to do for the day. So those were the ones that were publicized. There were, like any computer test, computer delivered tests, there were other types of issues that would occur during the year, but none that were statewide, affect every user across the state at the same time.
Okay, and then just one
Did you
more
follow up?
follow-up. So for the students, because I know that there were a few students that had to redo a stage, were you ever able to recover the stage that was apparently lost, or was that, do you know about that? And was that accounted for in, as far as like the participation codes that you showed? And in the accuracy of, because I know I would think a student would be frustrated, like you said, if they have to redo a stage. And I know that there were a few, it wasn't statewide, but, I mean,
Yeah.
not a ton, but there were a few. I know of some in my district that had to, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so as we look at the customer service logs, and we had a staff member here that requested CC that looked at every customer service, and it's in the, I think it was around 11, 12,000 tickets that were submitted during that testing window. We do know that there were times where test sessions were reset intentionally, that an LEA chose to do it. So let me give you an example. I think it was sixth grade math, has the 2 panels, but on panel 1, there's also a calculator section. So there's a separate section of the test. And sometimes students, they weren't attending closely enough, or if they weren't given the directions appropriately, because the system allowed this to happen, they could finish, say that they're done with panel 1 without completing the calculator section of the test, and go on. And then there were some decisions that were made at the local level, and that's just an example. There's others, but should we reset the test, or should we accept it with what the student submitted? If we reset it, it wipes all their answers, and then they have to complete those again. There are probably a number of others, but all test events, both in the reset data that we asked to be sent back. One of the challenges at looking at those at the state level is we're so far removed from each student. So we can see some things at the macro level, the state, but providing it to the LEA so that they can go right down to, hey, Mr. Nielsen had Johnny last year, and it looks like we don't have a scale score. He's under the reset, and try to investigate specific incidences about that. We're really a little bit restricted on our ability to look down to every individual case.
Okay. Board Member Belknap?
Thank you, Chair. Darren, I have a question from slide 1, but you don't have to pull it up.
Okay.
Okay, but you said in here that Questar did the research or the study on this. My question is, what advantage is it to Questar, or is there any for them to say this data is accurate, correct, or usable? Is there anything that's positive to them by saying that?
Well, if we need to remember, though, that the study was conducted by them, but we required them to have it validated by a third party. So I guess we could infer that there might be advantages, because we're still in the process of determining liquidated damages and as we exit our contract status with them. But my confidence that the Center for Assessment was able to, and part of our requirement for them is it needed to be replicable. So their study and the data that was used for it needs to be replicable by a third-party independent group.
Thank you, Darren.
Okay. Any other questions, comments from board members? Seeing none. Oh, Linda. Board Member Linda Hansen.
I'm concerned about how the LEAs are responding to all of this. If someone has that answer, or if we could perhaps ask Terry Shoemaker to come up and let us know how things are going out in the LEAs.
Why don't we have Darren answer that question while I invite Terry Shoemaker up? So
Obviously, I haven't spoken to all the LEAs. I would use this as the way to describe it. I think there's certainly an uneasy feeling. The uneasy feeling was not completely separated from the assessment piece, because a lot of the assessment piece, as I mentioned, is moving behind us. It's being used. I received my son's results from his 7th grade tests. I looked at them in comparison to what I expected them to be. It fit into my expectations and supported the evidence that I had. But uneasy would certainly be a word that I've felt as I've communicated with some LEAs, but it really is related to the concept of applying accountability now. So I would also say there's always some uneasy feelings about accountability, or uncomfortable feelings or unfavorable feelings when we start talking accountability, even in the best of circumstances.
Terry, is there any other superintendents that might want to come up with?
Well, I don't think we have any others here with us right now, but
Okay.
Rich could.
So I'll turn.
If it's okay.
You heard the question, so
Yeah.
name, rank, serial number, and all that good stuff.
Thank you. Terry Shoemaker with the Utah School Boards Association and the Utah School Superintendents Association. I think it would be vastly inaccurate to say that this testing session that occurred this last year did not impact our teachers and our students and our schools. It did. In fact, without rehearsing all that went on last spring, there's no reason for us to say that that wasn't the case. Because of that, the confidence level that has been expressed has been fairly negative. I mean, we don't feel that this has been a fair session for our students. And I think that's been a challenge for us. We recognize the statistical emphasis that's been done here by the State Board of Education to see how valid these results are. We're not questioning the results of that at this point. We don't see that that's something that we're interested in. We're interested in moving forward in appropriate ways, but also leaving the message that we lack confidence that this is really going to do what we want it to do in terms of accountability. And maybe for a way for me to emphasize that, we can turn to Superintendent Rich Nye from Ogden, who can maybe share the Ogden experience, which would be typical of many school districts.
Superintendent Nye? Is that on? Here we go. There it is.
Now we're on. Thank you. Rich Nye, Superintendent of the Ogden School District. Good to see you again. To what Terry has said and to what has been presented here, at the statewide levels, we look at the data. The numbers are pretty clear. One thing, though, is we are looking at, in the Ogden School District, and I know many of my counterparts are, is what are the impact levels at the student experience and how might that have compromised those results. And as we look at that, we then, of course, aggregate it from the student level to the school level, to the teacher level, to see where we know and have documented testing interruptions for one reason or another. We are looking at that data. We are running an analysis to determine its effects. So from an LEA's perspective, a school district's perspective, and actually talking with other charters there, for those that have the capacity, they are looking at the data in that light, because it really does drive the conversations that we have with students, with parents, and how teachers respond to how students are performing on this and other measures. So don't get me wrong, we do use multiple measures. But overall, it really is getting into the details and the granular level as to what the student experience was at each of our schools. And we have identified a couple areas where we have some concerns within a few of our schools where the interruptions were significant at that level. And we're exploring those options.
So hang up here, or stay up here. Superintendent, I've got a question for you. Is the vision, mission, purpose of all this accountability is one thing, but then there's student achievement. And the primary goal is student achievement. Did it happen, yes or no? And in your particular district, can you say there was with the data that you've received and you have a fantastic district with a lot of resources, can you assess based on the data that you received that education happened, and where are your weaknesses and deficiencies? Because the school year started, and so everyone's kind of scrambling to, again, make education happen and work on these deficiencies. Do you have enough data to make that assessment and your teachers make those corrections? Oh, let me turn this back on.
Thank you. We do, in overall, I mean, student achievement is really at the heart of our purpose, our mission, as to why we exist as a system. With that being said, we do use multiple measures, knowing that we're looking to our practices to determine how well our students are progressing. RISE data, SAGE data, ACT data, these statewide measures are one element among others that we use to determine how students are progressing along that path. With that being said, we know that the RISE data and other statewide assessment data play a big role, a critical role in how we look at that. One, because of the way they're administered. They're standard across all students, and we looked at ways of improving our practice internally as we work within our district, but externally as we look to others as well in that space. And so in answer to the question, we do in terms of accountability. I mean, and imagine we're going to be moving into that space in just a moment, so I don't mean to jump the gun. I mean, there's some nuances there. When it comes to using this data, and as I mentioned, there's at least 2 particular schools where we have seen red flags in where the RISE data isn't correlating with other metrics, and as we have identified some testing interruptions, we're pulling on that thread to see to what extent that did occur in that way or compromise it.
Okay. Thank you for answering that question. Board members, any? Okay, not seeing any. Let's go to Board Member Cindy Davis. I just turned you back off. Will you turn your mic back on? I don't know why I clicked. There we go.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion. I'll read it rather slowly because it has 2 parts. I move that we direct staff to engage with legislators to identify flexibilities from state accountability requirements, including the assignment of letter grades and identifying schools for improvement, and allow LEAs to add a quantifiable disclaimer on dashboard. And I'd like to speak to the motion.
We have a motion, a motion and a second. Board Member Davis, do you want to speak to your motion?
Yes.
Please.
We appreciate you for coming today and for your assessment. And our staff has been so great. Darren, I was just with a bunch of superintendents last night that said they want to make sure that you have communicated. So they use the word perfectly throughout this process. So thank you for that. So we are looking at these assessments of the assessments and saying we feel like these are tools that teachers can use and they can start studying and using these to look at these macro level trends and make some decisions. But we also want our boots on the ground to know that we hear the qualitative data that you are bringing to us as state school board members. And that qualitative data is a little harder to quantify. And so in light of that qualitative data and some of the lack of confidence because of that is out there, this is why I'm making the motion to seek flexibility from some state requirements and have our staff enter the conversation with legislators. Where are the areas that we can work together? Because the bottom line is the local school boards, the local superintendents and staff and teachers and parents, the state school board, the state superintendency, our legislators, we are on the same team. We want to work together so that we can use the tools that we have to move forward and so that student learning will continue and that we can also look at some of these macro level trends that this data helps us to have. But I really feel like in order to hear and listen and understand the qualitative data that our folks are bringing to us, we also should be seeking some flexibility. And that's why I support this motion.
Okay, speaking to the motion, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
I just have a question. Can you explain maybe an example of what you mean by a quantifiable disclaimer?
Yes. Chair, is that okay?
Yes, please.
So, for example, last night I was with some superintendents and local board members, and one of the superintendents said, the provost superintendent said, we have had reported to us 20% of our students that had some interruptions. So he should be able to, in the section on dashboard where schools can bring their own data, which we added last year, which is a great addition to dashboard, he should be able to say, here's our data. We had 20% students that had interruptions. So that folks that look at dashboard can keep that in mind while they're looking at the data, that there's some voice that these local LEAs can have in the spot where people are going to be viewing their data.
That was your question.
Can I ask a
A follow-up? Yes, Brittany.
So is it the intent that that quantifiable information would just be self-reported, not validated in any way? It's just a self-reported piece of information?
Can I answer that?
Okay. Cindy?
I think that our staff could validate that and have conversations with the LEA.
I think it would be safe to assume that whatever we put on there will be validated. Okay, so comment?
Yeah, so I think Board Member Davis is talking about is the self-reported indicators element of the digital school report card. So currently, LEAs can upload 2 different pieces of evidence of self-report indicator, things that are happening in their school that help paint a fuller picture of the school. There's not a current structure for us to review or approve that. It's all done at the school, and then the LEA, the district level, has an approval process before they get published. That can be changed if there's a need for that. It would require staff time significantly. So I guess my point is currently the context is whatever an LEA uploads into the self-report indicator isn't validated. It's validated because it's publicly transparent. And so if I'm a principal and I upload that we have a great bullying program, I better have it because my public can see that what I said about it. So that'd be my only hesitation is just getting clarity on what that would look like if staff's going to go through, have 1,000 schools, 2 self-reported indicators. They all wouldn't need to be reviewed for quality. And I'd be nervous about us sliding into a place where beyond this, there's some expectation of auditing or monitoring that goes on in those. That would be a change of philosophy on how that self-report indicator is set up.
Board Member Bolter?
I have a question. This motion, right now, we're trying to decide whether or not to use this current, last year's RISE data in school grading. So would this motion also cover that?
Yeah, Cindy? Yeah. Oh, sorry, just turned it back off again, sorry. There you go.
So we don't get to make that decision,
Right.
but this motion is asking our staff to ask legislators for flexibility on state accountability, and it would include, not limited to, but it would include letter grades and identifying schools for improvement. And then if there are other areas of flexibility that they can determine with legislators, that could be visited as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen?
Just a question for Board Member Davis on the quantifiable disclaimer to the dashboard. In light of what we heard about maybe some of the difficulties with that, would a standard disclaimer maybe address some of those concerns where we put a disclaimer on all of it that says, there were interruptions, there were some issues with test data?
Cindy, yes.
I would certainly support that because it could include some quantifiable information as to how many and what percent. We have 95%, but there was this percent of interruption or whatever. So I'd like to change my motion. Can I do that now? Or do I need to
just
substitute?
Tell me what you prefer it to say.
I'd prefer it to say, at the bottom 2 lines, it would say identifying schools for improvement, and then the bottom 2 lines would say, and the dashboard will include a disclaimer indicating that interruptions occurred in testing.
Okay. The
Can I say
person that
something
made the second, are you still good?
May I have one clarifying question?
Yes. I'm not sure I'm guessing is, no, that's Lear. Board Member Lear, will you turn your back on? Oh, there we go. Got it. Yeah.
Thank you. So the clarifying question would be that the state would put that on the dashboard and not the districts wouldn't have to create that. Okay, yes, I'm good with that, so I'll second that.
Okay. Discussion, Board Member Lear?
I had it, when you said discussion.
I'm just saying, I, without any objection, we'll leave that on for discussion.
And I just had a general kind of
You
discussion
bet.
question to the motion.
Please, yes, please ask.
And this is maybe somewhat a question for Board Member Davis, who made the motion, maybe involving Darren. I completely support the motion. My concern is that it's so open-ended. And I would hope that, yes, I'm asking you what you think, that just entering into discussions with legislators or engaging legislators doesn't necessarily put anything different on the dashboard or communicate the concerns if we just start to talk about this. Did you intend something more? Did you intend something more specific than that, or more active than that, or are you content to just say we'll start talking to them? Yes, or a timeline.
yes.
I mean, well, I would think it would need to be prior to this, when are we reporting? Prior to reporting. This would be prior to reporting, and we don't have control over more than this. They have control. So all we really can do is ask, as far as I understand.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
What is the timeline? This is maybe for Darren, for Darren for sure. What is the timeline on the letter grade? I don't know if it's reporting or.
Publication.
Yeah, publication, thank you.
Chair, can I address that then?
Yes, please.
Right now, we're looking at the first week in December of being a restricted release for LEA review. Typically, we allow them to review the report cards to look for accuracy, just another checks and balances before it goes public. So we'd be looking at the end of the first week in December currently. There's still a few variables that could delay that, as we're still trying to finalize some of our data with Pearson. And that date is determined by staff, and so if directed by the board, we could respond. There's no statutory requirement on when that's published, so we would take direction from the board if there's a need to move that to a later point. Our responsibility, one of them, is just to make sure we're clear to the field about when they can expect that. And the public, it's public access to transparency, and so. The general public, we see a lot of traffic on that report card when it's released each year. And so just as staff, we just need to know that so we can communicate clearly to our audiences.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins?
Yeah, I'd like to speak in favor of the motion. I think it, as stated, it provides direction in an immediate sense, but also the flexibility to solve this problem in the most effective way for students and getting at what we want. The only question I have is if we just leave the disclaimer in a public setting that said there were disruptions to the testing, does it just bring up questions? And should we possibly have somewhere on our assessment or on the dashboard site, not necessarily on each dashboard, but somewhere where there's a link to the analysis of the data so that the public would have the ability that if they were curious that they could say, okay, there were disruptions, but why are we moving forward using this data? Well, here's the information that you can read if you want to reference the decision-making process and how the data was not necessarily harmed at the macro level by the disruptions.
And I think it doesn't take a board, maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't take a board motion for us on our website to post any of that. That's why I'm really kind of like, we're getting way down into the weeds here of disclaimers to this, to that, or what's happening here. So I throw a little caution that way. Board Member Jenny Earl?
Yeah, I do like the idea of providing districts with our parents, community members with information about the data, and if there's any discrepancies. I do have a little bit of a concern if the disclaimer is just a broad, there could have been some problems associated with this, and especially if a specific district had specific needs that needed to be addressed. Maybe one specific school, where it's probably not a good idea for the LEA themselves to say, well, this is what we think it means. I still think it might be, I think it would be valuable for them to refer back to the, professionals here and say, could you please post, I don't know how that works, but so it's not just coming from the LEA saying, this is what we think it means, but there's some validation to their concern, because I think there were pockets of concerns, not overall concerns. And so to put just a general disclaimer, anyways, that I think this is going in the right direction so that the public is very aware of what's going on, but I still have a concern that we may have specific needs for specific schools, and that's not really addressing that. So.
Okay. Well, there's some other want to dive in. Cindy, did you want to respond?
Just to quickly clarify, I picture that disclaimer as looking somewhat like the PowerPoints, and we can link to this, that Darren has given in on the Hill, with just kind of information. This is how many interruptions we had. This is how much data we have available. These are the times it happened. And then I think that it would be appropriate to include verbiage addressing parents or public members to go and talk with their local LEAs if they have questions about the data. They're not calling us about the data. We can say, talk with your LEA, and then they can have those conversations about more specifics.
Board Member Mark Marsh.
First of all, having met with some of the districts and visited with superintendents, testing directors, and teachers in my area, I think this is going to be a good fix for the issue at hand, the problem that we have. And so I would be voting in favor of this because I think it opens it up and it's clear, but yet it's open enough that schools can work within the means that we have here at the district office. One other comment that came out as I discussed this with those people in that district was a big thank you to Darren and the staff here at USBE for being proactive, for getting on the issue, for helping, for answering questions, probably the hundreds of questions an hour coming into this office during that testing period. A big thank you to them and for the hard work they've put in, and I don't think it's over. I think they still spend sleepless nights, but at that time, I think it's kudos to you and your staff if you would pass that on. Thank you.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
I just want to make sure that there's enough flexibility in this motion that the technical staff who has to do this can do it in the best way possible, so that we're not saying it has to be here and it look like this, because if we are requesting a technical change to the platform, it's more than just December getting it done. So is the motion flexible enough to allow the IT department to do this in the easiest, most efficient way possible?
Okay, this is an operational question, and so Superintendent, you want somebody to answer that? Come on up. There's quite a bit of whispering. Is that a yes or no, or looking for Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones?
Depends on the requirements. We need specific requirements in order to know what the timeline will be. So if we just, for example, if we were just to upload the statement, right, the disclaimer, then that's relatively easy. However, you're going to reconfigure the report card, then it would bump into the December timeline. So, we just really need to know the specificity of the requirements of what the report card, what right is with the report card.
I think the way the motion was put together, that on that report card, someone will see kind of that disclaimer someplace, somehow. Right. Is there a place?
So a follow-up question to that, is it the intention that that disclaimer would be on each school's individual report card or on the state page where they access each report card? So one disclaimer that's on the state page that then they see before they go to their school report card, or would it be preference that it shows up on each school report card?
Cindy? Want to make sure we're following your motion.
I mean, the preference is that they would see it on each school screen. However, they have to see the initial screen before they go to their individual school. So I think if it's right there, I think that would be fine.
Okay. Board Member Scott Nielsen.
Yes, I would like to speak in favor of the motion and move the previous question.
Okay. We have a motion to end debate here. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. Will the ayes raise your hand to end debate? Board Member Scott Nielsen, Board Member Linda Hansen, Board Member Mike Hines, Board Member Cindy Davis, Board Member Sean Newell, Board Member Belknap, Board Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Cannon, Board Member Mark Marsh, Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, myself. How many is that? That's 10. Okay. Okay, we're ending debate. The motion before the board is, maybe I better read it. Now, it doesn't show up on my screen, so I'm going to turn my head, but I'll talk about it. Is that the board directs staff to engage with legislators to identify flexibilities from state accountability requirements, including the assignment of letter grades, and identify schools for improvement, and the dashboard will include a disclaimer indicating that interruptions occurred in testing. All in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Okay. Darren, I think that was it. Thank you.